Good day. This is the recorded lecture for Chapter 4. It's scheduled to be covered in Week 3 of the course. Chapter 4 covers evolution, biological communities, and species interactions. This chapter covers a lot of ground, and so just as a reminder, as I showed you in the earlier lectures, it is easier for me to set up one meeting to record an entire chapter than set up multiple meetings that you have to access. So if you don't want to listen to this entire recorded lecture in one sitting, you can use the playback features and explore the recorded lecture as you see fit. This chapter starts with a discussion of evolution and then goes into these topics outlined here. Evolution is a core theme of biology, and evolution explains how we have the diversity of species we have today on our Earth. And it applies to natural species, but it applies to us too. We'll begin with a discussion about adaptation. The case study that opens your chapter gives you an overview of how Charles Darwin came to frame the theory of evolution. So you may want to look at that. One of the greatest difficulties for the theory of evolution was that little was known in Darwin's day of the mechanisms of heredity. In other words, how do species acquire the adaptations that we see in nature? Darwin could easily explain adaptations as he observed plants and animals. A polar bear, for example, is highly adapted to its environment. All you have to do is look at a polar bear and see that. Darwin's great idea is that he explained the process without understanding genes or the patterns of inheritance that we understand today. And no one for a long time could explain how genetic variation could arise in a natural population, or how inheritable traits could be sorted and recombined in offspring. This was true even though Mendel, who first proposed how traits were inherited, was a contemporary of Darwin's. It took nearly another century before biologists could use their understanding of molecular genetics to put together a modern synthesis of evolution that clarifies these details. Molecular genetics provides strong support for the theory of evolution, and we'll get to a little bit of that in later slides. So by definition, adaptation is the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment. I'm going to depart from the book a little bit here. I'm going to basically follow it, but I'll introduce some slides of my own. So we're going to discuss evolution and how it produces biodiversity. Biodiversity is a key issue that we are going to deal with in this course. Evolution helps to answer these two key questions. How do species arise? And why is there so much diversity on our planet? So part of the answer is natural selection leads to evolution. Natural selection is a powerful force that acts on organisms to adapt to a particular environment at a particular time. You'll note in your book that giraffes are used as an example. So what can a giraffe teach us about evolution? Giraffes don't have long necks because they stretch to reach treetop leaves. But those giraffes that happen to have longer necks got access to more food and had more offspring that were successful. So the trait of longer necks became more fixed in the population and increased over time. That's the essential concept of natural selection. So let's look at the giraffe a little bit. The giraffe is a famous example to use to explain adaptations and how natural selection works. There was a debate between the Darwinian view, and you can look at this up, the Lamarckian view, of how organisms acquired adaptations during the time of Darwin. So let's take a look at giraffes. The giraffe inhabits savannas, grasslands, and open forests. They are browsers, much like our local black-tailed deer. They feed mostly on twigs and tree leaves. But they have to be flexible about their diet. Being so tall in their current environment, they obviously have a clear advantage reaching tree leaves and branches, as you can see from these slides. But they also eat grasses, so they have to awkwardly lower their necks to graze on the grass cover, as you can see. And that proposes some difficulties physiologically in terms of pumping blood and circulating blood to the neck and the head. And what about drinking water, as you can also see from these pictures on this slide? Animals, and also plants, acquire adaptations by selection of successful phenotypes. A phenotype is the expression of genes in the organism. Height is not the only adaptation that giraffes may need to acquire to be successful in their environment. For example, giraffes have tongues that are over 2 feet long. This allows them to reach between the spines of the savanna trees, which tend to be very spiny, and pull out the tender leaves between the spines. Another aspect of giraffes is their behavior with their long necks. They use their long necks in courtship and for defense, as you can kind of see in one of these pictures here. So, are their long necks as a result of adaptations to strictly feed in trees, or is it a combination of feeding and defense? What about the camouflage of the giraffes? Adults tend to stand out in the landscape, so what is the camouflage for? And why does it darken with age? The answer is that camouflage is mostly for newborns. Adult giraffes can also defend themselves for the most part with those long necks. So the idea of a long neck is used for a variety of purposes. And the long necks, as it turned out over time, were more successful against the other awkward aspects of the giraffe when reaching ground foods and water. So going back to Darwin, this is just a picture of Darwin's voyage. He spent 5 years on the HMS Beagle and circumnavigated the globe. So this voyage, and a voyage to the diversity of all these different types of habitats around the globe, gave Darwin a unique view of the diversity of the world. This helped him construct his theory of evolution and the mechanism of natural selection. So the theory of natural selection, or the mechanism of natural selection, is that some individuals have favorable characters, we now call those genes, for their environment, that are more likely to reproduce and pass on those favorable or good genes to the next generation. From this slide, you can see some renderings of some of the ancestral species before we got our current living species of giraffe. So if at one point there were short-necked giraffes, what happened to produce these long necks? That's where some of the mystery of genetics comes in. But at some point, a mutation could have occurred in a population to make a long-necked giraffe, or the capability of making a long-necked giraffe. These longer-necked giraffes were more successful than the short-necked ones. So they would reproduce more and leave more offspring that have the desired long neck. And over time, there would be more long necks in the population. If they were much better adapted than short-necked species, then eventually, through competition, the long-necked versions would have completely replaced the short-necked animals. There might have been genetic variety in the genomes of giraffes, giving them the capability of growing longer vertebrae in their necks by how long gene switches were left on for the development of bone cells. So with this capability, longer and longer necks would have been selected over time. So this is how the mechanism of natural selection works. The mechanism of natural selection is a little counterintuitive. So first, all organisms produce more offspring than can survive. We'll visit this when we look at populations. Two, no two organisms are exactly alike due to genetic recombination and sexual reproduction. So we'll take a look at that specific mechanism. But what that basically says is that there's a lot of variety in the genomes of every species. You can look at your own family and see that. And this is true for all species. Because of number one and number two, among organisms there's a constant struggle for survival, because all of us can produce more species than we actually need to replace ourselves. So in a community of multiple species, that sets up a struggle or a competition for resources. Because of this struggle, individuals that have characteristics that give them an adaptive advantage will produce more offspring. These adaptive characteristics become more common over time, and the less adaptive characteristics are lost from that population. So because of this sequence of events, natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. And when we're looking at specifically the change of adaptive characteristics over shorter periods of time, we call that microevolution. So evolution produces species diversity. So the next question is, why so many species? A species can be defined as a group of organisms whose members can breed and produce fertile offspring, but who do not produce fertile offspring with members of other species or other groups. So an important question to environmental scientists is, what are the mechanisms that promote the great variety of species on Earth and that determine which species survive in one environment but not in another? So let's look at speciation. Speciation is the emergence of new species. Every time speciation occurs, the diversity of life increases. The many millions of species on Earth have all arisen from an ancestral life form that lived about 3.6 billion years ago. So it is speciation that is the bridge between microevolution, these changes of adaptive characteristics in a population of organisms over time, and macroevolution, which is the history of life on Earth. We're going to get a little bit into those definitions in the next slide. But let's look at this again. Genetic traits are passed from generation to generation and allow a species to live more successfully in its environment. So this process of adaptation to the environment is explained by the theory of evolution and the mechanism of natural selection, for the most part. The basic idea of evolution is that species change over generations because individuals compete for scarce resources, as we discussed in the previous slide. Better competitors in a population survive. They have greater reproductive potential or fitness, and their offspring inherit these beneficial traits. The development of new species is called speciation, as I have just defined for you. Darwin believed that new species arise only very gradually over immense long times. In some organisms, however, adaptive changes have occurred fast enough to be observed. So we introduce the two terms, microevolution and macroevolution, on the next slide in the context of how speciation events occur. Microevolution alone does not lead to a diversity of species, that is, adaptive changes over time. Other mechanisms have to be laid over these changes to cause new species to branch off from ancestral species. So macroevolution looks at the history of how species change over time and how these branch points develop. So I'm getting a little repetitive here, but I want to go over these terms. Microevolution is the change in a population's gene pool over a succession of generations. So this diagram shows one species evolving into two. Other mechanisms operate to separate and cause a new species to branch off. So speciation leads to macroevolution and species diversity. Macroevolution is the study of how life changed overall over long periods of time. So it's macroevolution that looks at the origin of new species and the impact of some of these speciation causes, such as catastrophic events like mass extinctions, or how a new island gets colonized and what happens to those species. So let's begin to look at how these microevolution events occur. So traits are encoded in a species' DNA. Every species has amazing diversity in its DNA. We're going to look at how that actually happens at a genetic level in a minute. DNA changes occur, and when these changes occur, these changes are inherited. So random changes will occur in the replication of DNA. These are called mutations. There are random changes, but there are also imposed changes, such as exposure to ionizing radiation or toxic materials, that can also cause mutations in DNA. Also, with every generation, the genes from each parent are shuffled in the offspring, leading to infinite combinations of traits. The selection pressures, that is natural selection, operates on the traits of these organisms in their environments. This is an example of two forms of genetic variety. Ladybird beetles, or ladybugs, you can see how much variation there is in their coloring. So if this coloring has some kind of, a particular type of coloring has some kind of adaptive advantage, those particular patterns will increase in the population, for example. Garter snakes, here's another example where the same species, essentially, of snake have a variety of colors. So genetic variety is everywhere. Okay, so let's briefly look at mutation and sexual recombination, the two sources of genetic variety, very quickly at the genetic level. The chart on your top left here shows examples of mutation. You can have deletions, duplications, or insertions of specific base pairs in DNA just by random changes. Those can change the outcome of the expression of the phenotype, how the metabolism is affected or how coloring is affected, and all the things that affect how the organism lives, its phenotype. You can also have gross changes in these in the chromosomes themselves because of pieces getting deleted and getting put onto other pieces and so forth. So that's one source of genetic variety. At a more micro level on the colored chart at the low left, you can see how simple things like a substitution of a base pair or insertion of a base pair or a deletion of a base pair changes the sequence of how proteins are produced by the coding DNA. So these are all examples of mutations and how mutations change DNA. Now we're going to go over to the right and look at sexual recombination. To illustrate this point quickly, here is a colorized karyotype or map picture of the human genome with the 46 chromosomes in their pairs. So you can see that there. I've got an arrow at the one of the sets of chromosomes, one pair. So when organisms, humans sexually reproduce, and all organisms sexually reproduce. That pair is split up, and each one goes each into the reproductive cells, or we call those gametes. So when an egg is fertilized with sperm, or when any kind of sexual reproduction takes place, those chromosomes are recombined with the chromosome from the mother and the chromosome from the father. So if I take other individuals and colorize them, as you can see in the series of those 4 slides there, and those are recombined, one from the mother, one from the father, they basically create, in a lot of cases, a unique combination. So you can see how I recolor that particular pair of chromosomes there. So if you talk about shuffling 46 chromosomes in different ways, you can see how you can get an infinite variety of different forms of genes through sexual recombination. So mutation and sexual recombination create a lot of variety. So that's the genetic aspect here. So now let's look at selection pressures. All species live within limits. Environmental factors exert selection pressure and influence the fitness of individuals and their offspring. For this reason, most species tend to get forced into a range of conditions in which they can be successful. Limitations include physiological stress due to inappropriate levels of some critical factors such as moisture, light, temperature, pH, or specific nutrients. So in this photo here, you can see the saguaro cactus that inhabits more desert-like environments. Saguaro can tolerate, a little bit of cold, but if the environment became permanently cold, that would be beyond the saguaro cactus's tolerance limit. Other factors include competition with other species or within species, and predation, including parasitism and disease. And there's a little bit of randomization or luck to all of this. So this graph from your book shows the principle of tolerance limits. It states that for every environmental factor, an organism has both maximum and minimum levels beyond which it cannot survive. The greatest abundance of any species along an environmental gradient is found around the optimum level of the critical factor most important for that species. Near the tolerance limits, abundance decreases because fewer individuals are able to survive the stresses imposed by those limiting factors. So what this basically says is that natural selection forces sort of an optimum range on species where they can be successful. So the way this plays out, let's look at habitat and the concept of ecological niche. Habitat describes the place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. A more functional term from an ecological point of view is the ecological niche, which describes either the role played by a species in a biological community or the total set of environmental factors that determine how a species is distributed. So let's look at two species here in this slide. Black-tailed deer, which I mentioned, is a local species, has a very broad niche. You probably see black-tailed deer everywhere. The giant panda, on the other hand, has a very specific niche. The giant panda inhabits a particular region of China, naturally, and depends almost totally on bamboo forests for its nutrition. Both of these species are highly successful in the environments that they're adapted to. Competition, and we talked about the reasons for competition, causes resource partitioning and niche specialization. Where the niches of two species overlap, they're going to compete directly. So competition will occur. Individuals in this part of the niche will have less success producing young. So traits that are less competitive will be selected. Over time, the traits of the populations will diverge, leading to specialization. So a narrowing of these tolerance limits, or the niche breadth, if you want to think about it. And then there's less competition between species. So you can kind of see how this competition will lead to divergence of species. So again, ecological niche describes either the role played by a species in a biological community or the total set of environmental factors that determine a species distribution. Competition will lower the population, or looking at it another way, it'll lower the carrying capacity of the environment if populations compete directly. Carrying capacity is defined as the maximum number of individuals of any species that can be supported by a particular ecosystem on a long-term basis. So competition is a strong selective force that pushes species toward resource partitioning, and then at some point possibly the divergence of species. So let's look at some examples. This is one of my favorite ones. Woodpeckers. In almost any woodlot you'll find 3 to 6 different species of woodpeckers. Now they're all very closely related from an evolutionary point of view. But they partition the resource of a woodlot into different types of sources that they exploit, typically different parts of the tree branches at different heights, different sizes. Or in some cases, some of these woodpeckers will exploit the ground resources for insects. You can see the pileated woodpecker here has a much larger beak, allowing it to exploit heavier woods where it can get access to insect resources or larvae and things like that. Another example is the cichlids. This is an example used in your book. I'll give a little bit more detail here. You probably, if you've had a freshwater aquarium in your home, you've probably had a few cichlids in it. Cichlids originate from East Africa's Lake Victoria, where there were over 500 species of cichlid fishes that lived there originally. They're all very closely related to each other, but how did this many species evolve in that lake? And then the other question becomes, why are they disappearing now? So we're getting at some of our environmental issues as well. So the pronunciation of the fish is called cichlid. So you can see these 4 different examples where each color pattern indicates a particular type of mouth part and that the fish possesses to take advantage of different types of foods. So in this large lake that was isolated, these fish would have competed directly with each other unless they evolved different ways of exploiting the food source in the lake. So this is kind of how this extensive resource petitioning occurred. This is a map showing where Lake Victoria is, and this cichlid phenomena actually occurred in a lot of these different lakes. If you're interested in this area, take a look at it on Google Earth. So Lake Victoria's cichlids diversified about 100,000 years ago, so that's a relatively short time. These different species of cichlid developed different mouth parts. That allowed them to specialize on different food sources. The bright colors of the males varied with species, so females choose males with very specific colors. So these females chose male patterns. The coloring indicates the degree of adaptation to exploit a food source, in other words, stronger genes for obtaining food. The brighter the colors, the healthier the males are, and the less parasite loads are carried in the individual, they've discovered. So over time, these traits are exaggerated in males to the point where they separate the species. So the female will only select the male color pattern of her own species. Like giraffes, other traits to indicate strong genes led to speciation and the loss of the ability to interbreed with other closely related species because of this strong sexual choice of females. Now, over the last 30 years, things have changed. 200 species of cichlids have disappeared from Lake Victoria. Some were eaten by an introduced species that we're going to talk about at the end of this presentation, called the Nile perch. But also because of development around Lake Victoria, the water is more polluted. So it's more difficult for females to see the brightly covered males of the right species. So as a result, females are choosing the wrong species and their gene pools are starting to mix again. So the multiple species are fusing back into one. This phenomenon has also been studied on the Galapagos finches. Darwin made the Galapagos Island finches famous for their different beak sizes and different feeding strategies that you can see in this slide. They're all closely related to each other. There was probably an ancestral species that arrived on the island. Because of the availability of a variety of food sources, natural selection forced speciation on this one ancestral species to develop a variety of species of finch that could exploit these different types of food resources. Another interesting aspect of this is the studies that have been done by Peter and Rosemary Grant. What they find is that we have these different finches that can feed on large hard seeds, the large ground finch, that heavy beak there, and the cactus ground finch that can feed on cactus fruits and flowers, and so on. What happens when the weather is favorable and there's lots of moisture is the seeds are kind of softer and there's more production of seeds. So these species will hybridize sometimes, indicating they're not completely distinct as yet. But when the severe droughts come, it's when these specialized adaptations are very important, when the niche partitioning is very important. So these hybrids die out. Your book gives another example of warblers. Several species of insect-eating wood warblers occupy the same forests in eastern North America. The idea of niche partitioning or resource partitioning leads to the competitive exclusion principle, which predicts that warblers should partition the resource, that is insect food, in order to reduce competition, kind of like the woodpeckers. And in fact, the warblers feed in different parts of the forest. So a species trait, such as beak shape, changes in response to selection pressure. The original variation is acted on by selection pressure, shown in the arrows here, that shifts the characteristics of that trait in one direction, or to an immediate or to an intermediate condition. But competition also includes disruptive selection that moves characteristics to the extremes of the trait. So which selection type plausibly resulted in the two distinct beak shapes among the Galapagos finches? So earlier I explained that microevolution alone does not explain speciation. So we've discussed some ways that new species can result. There are other factors at work, and we make a distinction between two types. We call this allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. So this illustrates how allopatric speciation might work. A small population in a new location, an island, a mountaintop, or a unique habitat, encounters new environmental conditions that favor some individuals over others. The physical and behavioral traits that these individuals have are passed on to the next generation, and the frequency of the traits shifts in the population. Where a species may have existed but has died out, others arise and contribute to the incredible variety of life forms seen in nature. So an example is shown here. During cool, moist glacial periods, what is now Arizona was forest covered and squirrels could travel and interbreed freely. But as the climate warmed and dried, desert replaced forest on the plains. So squirrels were confined to cooler mountain tops, and they kind of acted like islands, in other words, refugia, where the species were isolated. So once a species is isolated, they're on separate evolutionary tracks, and they have separate selection pressures leading to different adaptations. And at some point, they diverge. So in allopatric speciation, geographic isolation leads to speciation. This is an illustration of the Grand Canyon, where the Colorado River separates two species of antelope squirrels. So the Grand Canyon is a big enough barrier that these two species of antelope squirrels, are distinct species. So in this case, allopatric speciation works for ground antelope squirrels, but would it work for hawks? I'll leave you with that question. So in review, the development of new species is called speciation, and allopatric speciation is where geographic isolation is part of that cause of divergence of new species. The other type of speciation is called sympatric speciation. This is where speciation takes place without geographic isolation, such as in woodpeckers, wood warblers, and the cichlids that we've already talked about. So new species arise within the same geographic area. So what happens is that gene flow between populations, or isolation of populations, is reduced by a number of different mechanisms. Mutations, habitat differentiation or partitioning, like we already talked about, or sexual selection. So it's thought in giraffes, for example, that part of the exaggeration of the long necks is not just due to the adaptation to exploit tree food resources. It's also the phenomenon of necking and courtship, which exaggerate successful necks, or males with longer necks. So all these things tend to interplay with each other. Another factor of sympatric speciation is called polyploidy. It's a form of mutation, and you might have seen that in the genetic slide that I showed earlier, but this is just a graphic reminder. This is particularly important in plants, where mistakes in production of the gametes, or the sexually reproducing cells of organisms, occur such that chromosomes are doubled or tripled. And that can lead to the development of new species, because you basically have a different chromosome number. So now we've kind of talked about the different ways that we develop new species. And again, I encourage you to read your chapter so you kind of have an understanding of how this works. Now we're going to look at other aspects of the evolutionary process and how living organisms behave in communities. So before we start, we want to define taxonomy. Taxonomy is the branch of science that studies how species are related to one another. This slide represents all of life organized into 6 kingdoms. This is the way your book treats it in particular. I want to point out that this is changing as we learn more about how to classify life forms, and particularly as molecular genetics gives us more information about the evolutionary relationships. If you've taken a biology course before, you might have been exposed to the domain kingdom system, so I'm also going to mention that. They both are shown on this slide. So the 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And then some biologists use the 4 kingdoms within eukarya. That includes protists, plants, fungi, and animals. So the next discussion that we're going to talk about is interspecific interactions. Interspecific interactions are a strong evolutionary force because they lead to adaptations or co-adaptations in species that are involved in the relationship or the interspecific interaction. This is a chart summarizing from another text the different types that are talked about in your book. So let's look at species interactions for a minute. You may have heard of the biological arms race. So competition is a type of antagonistic relationship within a biological community that also sets up these mechanisms for adaptation. Organisms compete for resources, we've talked about that before, that are in limited supply. Energy and matter in usable forms, living space, and specific sites to carry out life's activities. Plants, for example, compete for growing space to develop root and shoot systems so they can absorb and process sunlight, water, and nutrients. Animals compete for living, nesting, and feeding sites, and also for mates. You know, you may experience this all the time in your own life. If you get tired of competition in your workplace, school, or society, and I do too, but some of this is just part of life. So we look at the first form of interspecific interaction as direct competition. Competition may occur when a shared resource is limited. We mentioned the wood warblers, how they feed at different parts of the forest. But if an ecological niche directly overlaps and there is direct competition, and this is an example of two types of warblers with very similar niches, both populations of those species will be suppressed because they're competing with one another. If you remove one from the community, the other population will increase without that competition being there. Now, natural selection is a powerful force that forces niche partitioning, so this is not all that common. Mutualism is an example where both partners in the relationship are benefited, and we find that in many examples. Reef-building corals require mutualism. There are photosynthetic dinoflagellates that live in the cells of each coral polyp. Those dinoflagellates are photosynthetic, so they produce sugars that are used by the animal polyps in the coral. So that provides about half of the energy used by the coral animals, so then they can obtain the rest of their energy by feeding on the water, these sources in the water. So these coral reefs that's one reason why they're so productive, is because they have this mutualistic relationship. Now, we mentioned earlier about the bleaching of corals. You can see in this slide a close-up of the coral polyps. You can see a typical healthy coral reef here, and then you can see a bleached one. One of the reasons why ocean acidification, which is one of the consequences of climate change and global warming, it's the dinoflagellates that are particularly sensitive to ocean pH, and so it's one of the reasons why coral reefs are bleaching. Your book gives some other examples of mutualism here. Lichens. Lichens are actually a mutualistic relationship between a fungi and an algae. The fungi sort of digests detritus and nutrients and provides that to the algae, and then the algae is photosynthetic, so it provides sugar to the fungi. So this is a picture of a lichen on a rock. You see lichens all over our Bay Area. This little inset at the top is a typical, what we call California Spanish moss, that hangs from all the trees, and that actually is a lichen. This other example is an oxpecker and an impala, but we have our own North American versions of this mutualistic relationship, which is the cattle egret and domestic livestock. And the other example is a bromeliad. This is a form of mutualism where the bromeliad doesn't harm the tree on which it anchors itself. I presented this slide to you before, but now that we're talking about mutualism, the mycorrhizal associations with non-leguminous plants is a form of mutualism, and the association of nitrogen-fixing bacteria with leguminous plants is an example of mutualism. Predation is the other form of interspecies interaction. Predation benefits the predator, but obviously doesn't benefit the prey. So with many of the predator-prey relationships, there is an arms race or a co-adaptation race between the predator and the prey. So this has led to lots of protective strategies among different types of animals and plants. Camouflage, as you can see here, mechanical defenses such as the sea squirt, and then chemical defenses such as poisonous frogs. I like to look at rattlesnakes because I think this is a great example of predator-prey and adaptations in response to that. Rattlesnakes are a good example of a highly specialized predator. Since they are unable to move fast enough to catch their prey, rattlesnakes typically ambush them. They have camouflage on their bodies, and they sort of lie in wait, and they then use heat-detecting facial pits to identify their prey and inject them with fast-acting venom. Because the snakes are not very fast, the prey is released, and this helps the snake avoid damage from struggling with the prey, but the prey is then disabled by the venom. So the rattlesnake then uses a variety of senses to track the prey short distances and pick it up where it collapsed. So that's kind of how a rattlesnake is successful in its environment. But why would a rattlesnake rattle? It's because rattlesnakes are also prey to many other species. So they have a joint adaptation to predation, and they're also predators themselves. Young rattlers are particularly vulnerable to predation. Rattlesnakes also practice a form of mutualism. This is a snake ball. So many snakes, not just rattlesnakes, but many species of snakes congregate when the weather is cold and to keep warm. So they take turns being on the outside of the ball, and then they move inside to keep warm during cold periods. They'll use culverts like this slide, but they'll use a lot of caves and other burrows and other rocky overhangs to form these snake balls. How would you like to encounter a rattlesnake snake ball in the field? Herbivory, that is, animals eating plants, is actually a form of predation. In this case, the predator is the consumer and the prey is the plant. So the same type of competition results. Plants have developed numerous adaptations to defend against herbivores or primary consumers. They develop spines and thorns, they develop chemical toxins, and they also develop, in this case of grasses, basal growing points. So you can see in a grass the growing point isn't at the tip of the plant, it's at the base of the plant. So if an herbivore comes along and eats the blades of the grass, it can grow more from its basal growing points. So this form of competition, this interspecific interaction, gets very, very interesting and makes our animal and plant world fun to study, I think. So herbivores, for example, in plants undergo diverse adaptations. So here's an example. It's the example of the Passiflora plant and the Heliconius, or butterfly. So in this case, the butterfly lays its eggs on a Passiflora plant, and the larvae feed on the plant and then continue its metamorphosis into a mature butterfly. So you can see what the eggs look like. But the Passiflora plant has evolved a leaf form that produces sugar deposits that look like eggs. So the Heliconius butterfly will not lay eggs on a leaf that already has eggs on it, because why would you have her offspring compete with somebody else's offspring? So these types of situations happen all the time in nature, and it's evolution that drives this process. Another phenomenon is keystone species. Keystone species have a disproportionate impact on diversity. So a definition of a keystone species is that it plays a critical role in a biological community that is out of proportion to its abundance. It's named for the idea of a Roman arch where the keystone keeps the arch from collapsing. Originally, keystone species were thought to be top predators like lions, wolves, and tigers, which limited herbivore abundance and reduced the amount of grazing or herbivory on plants. But scientists now recognize that very many types of keystone phenomena occur, and less conspicuous species also play a role. So this is an example of the sea otter. The sea otters feed on sea urchins. Sea urchins feed on the anchor roots of kelp plants. So when a sea urchin feeds on a kelp, it basically eats through its anchor and then the kelp flows away. So the kelp, when it's present, provides a canopy or a ladder of habitat for a whole host of other species. So when the sea otters disappear from the kelp forest, the urchins take over the kelp, and then the whole ecosystem and the species diversity structure of that type of ecosystem collapses. So I want to go back to the figure again that I presented in Chapter 3. Also remember in Chapter 2 this bar chart showing primary productivity. And once again, a community's primary productivity is the rate of biomass production, and it's the indication of the rate of solar energy conversion to chemical energy. So this is another form that's presented in this chapter, Chapter 4 of your book. And it compares the primary productivity, or the net productivity, of the major world ecosystems. And it looks at the relative accumulation of biomass. So again, from the previous two charts, going back, going forward, note which ecosystems are the most productive. This is important for climate change, because the most productive ecosystems sequester the most carbon, that is, remove the most carbon from the atmosphere. So I think you've gotten the point in the couple of chapters is there's an enormous amount of complexity in nature. Complexity is the number of species at each trophic level in the feeding relationships and the number of trophic levels in a community. So diverse communities may not be complex if all species are clustered at just a few trophic levels. So a highly interconnected community may have many trophic levels. This complexity is also important. So tropical rainforests, as shown in this figure in your book, are complex structurally and ecologically. They're similar to the kelp forest, the example that I just mentioned. Trees form layers, each with a different amount of light and a unique combination of flora and fauna. Many insects, arthropods, birds, and mammals spend their entire life in the canopy. So in Brazil's Atlantic rainforest, for example, a single hectare had 450 tree species and many times that many insects. So with so many species, the ecological relationships are complex and they're highly connected. So diversity, this idea of complexity and connectedness, is widely considered important and has received a great deal of attention recently. In particular, humans have a great impact on diversity, and this is a concern of many ecologists. Robert MacArthur proposed in 1955 that complex interconnected communities would be more stable and resilient in the face of disturbance. So recall from Chapter 1 the study that suggested that diversity leads to better recovery of grassland species from drought, and we think this is true for many communities. All communities suffer disturbance. Most communities then recover. And very often there's an orderly sequence of recolonization of different species. This process is called succession. There are two types of succession, one where there is soil and one without soil. So when we don't have soil, there's a whole different set of species that have to sort of recolonize and create soil. We call that primary succession. This is where lichens, mosses are very important. After some soil develops, then other species take over. And this is called secondary succession. Both kinds of succession, the organisms change the environment by modifying soil, light levels, food supplies, and microclimate. So we kind of conclude this lecture with a look at introduced species and community change. If introduced species prey upon or compete more successfully than native populations, then the whole nature of that community may be altered. There are lots of examples of this. The introduction of rats, cats, goats, and pigs on islands occurred where European sailing ships landed. And we've been trying to get control of that with some of our international agreements. There's also intentional introduction of exotic species to try to solve some of these introductions. So mongooses, as an example that's used in your book, were released in Hawaii in an effort to control rats. However, the mongooses were active during the day while the rats were active at night, so they ignored each other. So in order to get food, the mongooses adapted and attacked defenseless native birds and became as big of a problem as the rats were. There are some other famous examples as well that I've provided in these insets here. European rabbits were introduced in Australia, and they quickly populated and overran the country. Foxes were introduced to try to feed on the European rabbits, but the foxes instead preyed on native species. You might have seen on the news recently the problem of escaped pythons breeding in the Everglades and overtaking the other native species. There's now a bounty program for trapping pythons that they're trying as a mechanism to solve this problem. However, there are some success cases, and I want to just mention one in California. Klamath weed was an introduced species that came into California in the early 1900s and was quickly overtaking rangelands and grasslands and competing with native species. The iridescent beetle from the same area, these were both from Europe, was introduced. and was highly successful. It basically took out the Klamath weed, and once the Klamath weed was gone, the iridescent beetle did not compete or take over the environment and start feeding on other native species. So this can work. Okay, so we've reached the end of chapter 4.